The alarm on the nightstand read 4:53 in the morning, but Colt Decker had been awake since 4:41. He always was. Not because the farm demanded it, though it did, and not because his body had simply forgotten how to sleep past 5 in the year since Donna died, though that was also true. He was awake because of the monitor. The small device on Hazel's bedside table transmitted a low, steady signal to the receiver he kept clipped to the collar of his undershirt, a habit he had started 3 years ago after a night that still made his hands go cold.
Cheers, everyone.
The signal was steady now. Green. The soft pulse of it against his chest, rhythmic and calm, was the first thing he checked every morning before he moved.
We can't keep putting this off.
He lay still for another minute in the gray dark of his bedroom, listening to the farmhouse settle around him. The old walls of the place spoke when the temperature dropped small creaks and pops that he had learned to read like weather. Tonight they were quiet. The forecast had said clear and cool, dropping into the upper 40s by dawn, and the house agreed. He got up without turning on the light. He knew the floor plan of this bedroom the way a man knows the terrain he crosses every single day, every loose board, every cold patch of hardwood, the exact angle of the doorframe that caught the light from the hallway. He dressed in the dark. Work jeans, flannel shirt, the worn leather boots that had been resoled twice and still were not ready to give up. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house this time of year. He started the coffee, first the way he always did, grinding the beans by hand, because the electric grinder vibrated through the floorboards, and Hazel's room was directly above the kitchen. He had discovered that on a Tuesday in February 2 years ago, and had never touched the electric grinder at dawn since. While the coffee came up, he pulled a small organizer from the cabinet above the refrigerator. The pill organizer was nothing special. White plastic, the kind you bought at any drugstore, but what was inside it was arranged with a precision that would have impressed a pharmacist. 4 medications each with its own dosage schedule, each cross-referenced against the sticky notes on the refrigerator door where he kept the current month's protocol. The cardiologist updated it every 6 to 8 weeks, depending on how her numbers were running. He measured the doses into a small cup, covered it with a square of plastic wrap, and set it on the counter beside a glass of water. Then he made her breakfast. Eggs this morning scrambled soft the way she liked them, with a piece of toast cut on the diagonal, because she had told him once years ago when she was 16 that toast tasted better cut at an angle, and he had never cut it any other way since. She would not be up for another 2 hours. The food would be cold by then. He would warm it up when she came downstairs, and she would pretend not to notice that he had been up since before 5, and he would pretend not to notice her pretending. This was their arrangement. It had its own kind of grace. He pulled on his jacket and went outside. The valley was still dark when he crossed the yard. The sky above the eastern ridge just beginning to go a shade lighter than pure black. He's the kind of deep blue that showed up maybe 15 minutes before the actual dawn. His breath came out in small clouds. The grass was wet and cold underfoot. The barn sat at the far end of the yard, and its big sliding doors closed against the night air, and from inside came the quiet sounds of the horses shifting in their stalls, aware of him before he even reached the door. There were 2 horses now. There had been 4 when Donna was alive. He had sold the other 2 the year after, not because he could not afford them, but because they were hers in a way the other 2 were not, and looking at them every morning had felt like something he could not afford to feel. The remaining 2, a sorrel gelding named Calhoun, and a gray mare that Hazel had named Patience when she was 12, were good horses. Steady, they did not ask much. He fed them, checked the water, ran his hands along Calhoun's neck the way the horse liked, then walked the perimeter of the east pasture in the gray pre-dawn light. This was a thing he did every morning, a slow walk of the fence line with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving. Part of it was practical. Fences broke and cattle got out, and the sooner you found the gap, the better. Part of it was something else, something he did not have a precise name for. The land had belonged to Donna's family. Her grandfather had built the original farmhouse. Her father had expanded it. She had grown up running these same fence lines, and when Colt walked them in the early morning quiet, he felt close to her in a way that nothing else quite provided. The farm was 412 acres. About 2/3 of it was active the hayfields in the South Valley, the pasture for the small cattle herd, the kitchen garden Hazel tended when she had the energy, the orchard along the western slope that still produced apples and pears every fall. The rest was timber and wild ground, a creek running through the lower section, a stand of old-growth white oak along the north ridge that Donna had refused to touch, and that Colt had no intention of touching either. He was 3/4 of the way around the east fence when he found the envelope, not lying on the ground, tucked under the top rail of the gate where the wood met the metal post wedged in deliberately so it would not blow away. A thick white envelope, good paper, the kind that came from offices where people charged $500 an hour for their time. His name was on the front in printed letters. No return address, though the envelope had a small embossed logo in the upper left corner. Roth Capital Development, LLC. He pulled it out, stood there at the gate with the envelope in his hand for a moment looking at the name on it. Then he opened it. The letter was 2 pages single-spaced on letterhead that matched the envelope's embossing. The language was careful and lawyerly, all conditionals and proposals and expressions of mutual benefit. But the number was clear. The number on that paper had enough zeros to wipe out Hazel's medical debt, refinance the farm equipment, and still leave enough to start over somewhere flat and quiet. It was objectively a large number. Colt read the letter twice. Then he walked to the burn barrel beside the barn, lit it with the lighter he kept in his jacket pocket for starting the wood stove, and dropped the letter in. He watched it catch and curl and go to ash. Then he went inside to warm up Hazel's eggs. She came downstairs at 7, wearing the oversized flannel shirt she had claimed from his closet the previous winter and a pair of wool socks that did not match. Her hair was loose. She moved carefully the way she always did in the morning, not tentatively exactly, but deliberately, the way someone moves when they have learned to listen to their own body. She was 20 years old and had been doing this since she was 17, since the diagnosis, since the morning the cardiologist had sat across from them in a small office and used words like congenital and permanent and manageable in a tone that made manageable feel like the best they could hope for. She saw the plate and the pillow cup on the counter and said, "Dad, you did not have to." He looked up from the sink where he was washing the skillet. Already done. She sat down and took the pills first the way the doctor had told her, with the full glass of water before the food. He watched her do it out of the corner of his eye without appearing to watch a skill he had developed over 3 years of practice. "You were up early," she said. "Got some fence to check." "You checked fence yesterday." "I know." She was looking at him. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown and direct, the kind of eyes that saw through you without being unkind about it. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the skillet. "You are doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you do not tell me something." He dried his hands on the dish towel and turned around. "Got an offer on the land. Let her under the gate." She went still. The fork she had been holding lowered to the plate. "How much?" He told her. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her doing the math, the same math he had done standing at the burn barrel. Medical debt versus equity, security versus everything else. "What did you do with it?" she asked. "Burned it." Her expression moved through something he could not quite read. "Dad, this land is yours. It was your grandmother's. Your mother grew up here. I am not selling it to a development company so somebody can build vacation condos over the creek. We do not know what they want to build. I know what they want. Same thing they want everywhere they go." He came and sat across from her. "Finish your eggs." She did, but she kept looking at him with those eyes. The name Victor Roth had arrived in Millhaven County the previous spring, the way certain kinds of men arrive in small places smoothly, with good timing and with the right words already prepared. He drove a black SUV with Tennessee plates and wore clothes that were expensive in the particular way that made them look casual. He had taken meetings with the county commissioners, bought rounds at the hotel bar for anyone who would sit down, and talked about economic opportunity and community partnership and property values in a tone that made people feel included in something larger than themselves. His company, Roth Capital Development, had projects in 4 states. The press releases listed mixed-use developments, eco-resort properties, revitalized rural communities. The press releases were well-written and largely accurate about the nature of the projects, if not entirely honest about the mechanisms behind them. What the press releases never described was what happened to people who said no. The land in Millhaven Valley was on its surface a collection of struggling farms. Low yields, aging equipment, thin margins, the kind of agricultural economy that had been in slow contraction for 30 years. That part was real. What was not common knowledge was what sat beneath the valley floor. A geological survey commissioned privately and quietly had confirmed what certain geologists had speculated about for a decade. A significant natural gas deposit deep enough that surface drilling would not have revealed it shallow enough to be economically viable with modern extraction techniques. Roth had the survey, no one else did. He moved methodically. His representatives made offers to each farm in the valley, starting with the most financially desperate working inward. The offers were fair, even generous in the way that an offer is generous when the person making it knows exactly what the thing is worth and is still choosing to pay less than that. By late summer, 19 of the 22 farms in the target area had signed. Most of the farmers cried when they signed. Some of them shook hands and drove away without looking back. All of them needed the money in ways that made the decision feel, if not good, at least survivable. 3 held out. Eleanor Myers, whose family had farmed the North Ridge for 80 years and who had a lawyer's son in Nashville who had told her not to sign anything without calling him first. Old Dale Carver, who had been approached twice and both times had listened politely, thanked the representative for coming and walked back inside his house without another word. And Colt Decker, who had burned the letter. To understand why Colt never walked away from that farm, you had to go back before it. Before the vest, before the valley, before Hazel's diagnosis changed everything. He had spent years in civilian disaster rescue operations attached to a volunteer corps that deployed to flood zones, collapsed structures, and the aftermath of storms that left entire communities without communication. Not combat, rescue, flood response, pulling people out of situations that most men never walk back into. He was good at it in the way some people are good at things that matter quietly without needing applause. He went where the water was rising and the radios had gone silent, and he brought people home. He had gone into floodwater in Louisiana and Kentucky and twice in Tennessee. He had pulled a family of 4 from a collapsed barn in a county that most maps did not show. He had carried an elderly man on his back through thigh-deep current for 200 yards at 3 in the morning and declined to speak to the camera crew that showed up at the staging area afterward. He did not do any of it for recognition. He did it because it needed doing, and he was capable of doing it, and there was no reason to look for any other justification beyond those 2 facts. Then Donna died. Sudden. No warning. A blood clot, the doctor said, as if that explained it, as if any explanation could make the floor feel solid again. He came home from the hospital that night and sat in the kitchen for 4 hours without moving. Hazel was 17. She found him there just before dawn and did not say anything. She just sat down next to him and put her hand on his arm. That was the moment he made the decision. Not out loud, just inside himself, quietly and completely. The rescue missions were done. The traveling was done. From now on, his only mission was right here. 3 months later, Hazel got her diagnosis, and Colt understood with a clarity that almost broke him, that the universe was not giving him room to grieve. It was giving him a reason to keep moving. His biker brothers and men he had known for over a decade became something he had not expected them to become. Real family. They showed up for the medical bills when the insurance fell short. They showed up on weekends to help repair fences and replace broken equipment. Ray had once driven Hazel to an emergency appointment at 2 in the morning because Colt's truck had blown a gasket and there was no one else to call. They never talked about it. They just showed up. The Iron Valley Riders had started as something modest, a loose association of men who liked to ride and had found in each other a kind of brotherhood that none of them would have been comfortable describing in those precise terms, but that all of them recognized and depended on. Over 16 years, they had become something more specific. They were the people you called at 2 in the morning. They were the people who showed up with tools on a Saturday without being asked. They were the people who did not require an explanation for why you needed them, only the fact that you did. Millhaven saw the vests and the bikes and the noise on Saturday mornings. The town did not see Ray Holden sitting in a plastic hospital chair for 5 hours without complaint. It did not see Calvin driving to 3 different auto parts suppliers at 7 in the morning to find the specific gasket Colt's truck needed. It did not see Emmett spending his lunch breaks researching medical billing appeals processes so he could help Colt write a letter that ultimately reduced an insurance denial by 40%. The town saw what was easy to see. The rest of it happened in the spaces between visible things, which is where most of the things that actually matter happen. Knox Slater drove an unmarked truck and paid cash for everything. He was not the kind of man who appeared in press releases. He had done this kind of work in 3 other counties over the past 4 years, contract work that came with precise specifications and no paper trail that connected back to his employer. He was methodical in the way that dangerous men are methodical, not brilliant, but patient, and patient men in his line of work got results. He started small. The night after Roth Capital received word that their letter had been refused, the top rail of the east pasture fence came down in a clean cut, not a break. A cut made with a tool someone knew how to use. In the morning, Colt found it crouched beside it in the gray light and ran his finger along the edge. He did not say anything. He got his tools and fixed it. Ray Holden noticed the change in him that same afternoon. Ray was the kind of man who was easy to underestimate because he was large and slow-moving and said very little. He had been in the Iron Valley Riders for 16 years, 3 years longer than Colt, and he understood Colt's silences the way a person understands a language they have been speaking for decades. He watched his brother of 12 years squat beside the repaired fence section without speaking, and he understood that whatever had started here was not going to end easily. The Iron Valley Riders were 22 men. They were not what most people in Mill Haven imagined when they thought about motorcycle clubs, though the people of Mill Haven thought about them rarely, and then mostly in the context of the noise their bikes made on Saturday mornings when they gathered at the diner. They were mechanics, veterans, farmers, a retired high school teacher, 2 brothers who ran a welding business, a man who drove long-haul trucks 6 months a year. They wore leather vests with the club patch, and they rode together, and they drank coffee and beer in roughly equal measure, and they showed up for each other in the way that people who have chosen each other as family tend to do. They showed up for Colt in particular because of what had happened when Donna died. He had not asked them to. He had not known how to ask. He had come home from the hospital and sat in the kitchen for 4 hours without moving. And when dawn came the next day, and then the day after that, he had gotten up and done what needed doing the way a man does when the alternative is simply stopping. 2 weeks after the funeral, he had come out of the barn at noon and found Ray sitting on the porch with sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, not talking just there. The week after that, 4 of them had come out on a Saturday and replaced the south pasture fence that had needed doing for a year. They did not ask permission. They just showed up with tools and did the work. He had never said anything about it. Neither had they. Some things did not require speech to be understood. The sabotage escalated over the following 3 weeks in a pattern that Colt recognized with the trained recognition of a man who had spent years reading escalating situations as deliberate and strategic. The hydraulic line on the irrigation pump in the south field was cut, not frayed, cut. A skilled cut in a place that would have taken someone time to reach and time to identify. The water pressure in the upper pasture tank dropped to nothing overnight. It took him a full day to find the blockage, which had been inserted with the kind of precision that spoke of someone who understood agricultural systems. Then the chemicals. He found the first cow on a Thursday mornings down in the east corner of the pasture, and he knew before he reached her. He had seen poisoned animals before years ago in places far from here, and the body spoke a particular language when it went that way. The second was in the same corner. He stood in that field in the morning light for a long time. He called the vet. He called Ray. He stood very still and looked at what had been done and let himself feel it clearly, precisely so that he understood the weight of it. Then he went back to the house and made coffee. Ray arrived 40 minutes later, and he knew from Colt's face when he came through the kitchen door. He poured himself a cup and sat down and did not say anything for a while. "Whoever did this knows what they are doing," Colt said. "Not amateurs." "No. Roth's people." Colt nodded slowly. "They want the land. They do not want to fight. They want me to make the math work and sign the paper." He looked out the window at the east pasture. "This is them telling me what the math looks like. What do you want to do?" Colt looked at him for a moment. "I want to find whoever did this to my animals and have a very direct conversation with them." Ray considered that. "And after that, I want my land." Ray finished his coffee. "Okay, then that is what we are doing." The stress was the thing Colt could not control. He could fix fences and replace equipment and absorb the financial cost of what was being done to the farm. What he could not fix was what it was doing to Hazel. She did not say anything. She was 20 years old and stubborn, in the particular way that children of resilient parents become stubborn, carrying weight quietly until the carrying itself became visible. But her color was off. She was sleeping more, which with her condition meant her body was rationing resources, pulling back from output to maintain function. The cardiologist adjusted her medication twice in 6 weeks. Colt drove her to the second appointment. They sat in the waiting room without speaking, the way they sat in waiting rooms side by side with their hands in their laps. When the nurse called her name and she stood up, she paused and looked at him. "You are doing the thing again," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you think this is your fault." He said nothing. "It is not," she said, and went through the door. The doctor's conversation afterward was careful in the way of doctors who were managing expectations over the long term rather than responding to a crisis. The arrhythmia was a stress response. Her heart simply did not handle sustained pressure well. The mechanical function of it was what it was, but the electrical function, the rhythm, the timing was susceptible to the kind of prolonged cortisol elevation that came from living in a difficult situation. Rest, stability, reduction of stressors. Colt drove home and sat in the truck in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. He understood the choice in front of him with a clarity that felt like cold water. Sell the farm, take the money, move somewhere flat and quiet, and watch Hazel's numbers stabilize. Or hold the line, protect what was hers, and watch her body pay the cost of it. He thought about Donna. He thought about her father who had built the first section of the barn by hand. He thought about the orchard in October when the pears came in and the whole valley smelled like something you could not put a name to, but that lived in the chest like a held breath. He went inside. Hazel was on the couch with a book, which meant she was tired, which meant she was conserving. She looked up when he came in. "What did the doctor actually say?" she said. Not a question. He sat in the armchair across from her. "She said the stress response is the issue, that your heart manages fine when the rest of things are manageable. And we need to stabilize things." She held his gaze. "Are we selling?" "No." She held the gaze a moment longer. Then she looked back at her book. "Okay, Hazel, I trust you," she said without looking up. "Just fix it." The equipment showed up on a Tuesday night. Colt was in Bookborn at 11:30, handling a colic situation with Calhoun, which had started around 9 and had improved but not resolved when he heard the sound of a vehicle on the back access road. The back road ran along the northern edge of the property and connected to the county road about a quarter-mile east. It was used for field access during harvest and occasionally by neighbors who were running late and did not want the longer route. At 11:30 on a Tuesday, it had no business being used. He left Calhoun with water and went out the side door. The vehicle had its lights off. He could not make out the model in the dark, just the shape of a truck with a flatbed moving slowly along the back fence line. He watched it from the shadow of the barn wall. It stopped near the old storage shed at the back acre. Two figures got out. He heard the sound of machinery being moved, the clank and scrape of metal on wood. He had a decision to make. He made it in about 3 seconds. He went inside and called Ray. "Do not go out there alone," Ray said. "I am not." "Do not touch anything." "I am not." "Colt, I heard you." He stood in the barn doorway and watched until the truck moved again. Lights still off, back down the access road and onto the county road heading west. Then he walked to the storage shed and looked at what was there. He had never seen any of it before in his life. 2 pieces of farm equipment, a baler and a PTO attachment, both with what appeared to be identification numbers that had not been filed off, just left as they were. He crouched beside them in the dark and looked at the marks in the soil around them. Fresh, very fresh, moved here within the last hour. He went back inside and did not sleep. In the morning, the call came. A deputy named Whitmore, someone Colt had seen at the gas station but did not know well, had a voice that was trying to be neutral and was not quite managing it. He had received a complaint from 2 neighboring farms. Equipment missing. Someone had told them it might be worth checking at the Decker place. Colt said he would be here. He called Ray next, then he called the other brothers who had been helping with the morning work lately. Emmett and Calvin and a man named Tucker, who had been farming 2 properties down for 11 years and had watched the whole campaign against Colt with a slow-building anger that had not yet found its outlet. They were all there when the first sheriff's vehicle came up the driveway. By the time the 6th one turned in, they were in the yard, visible, hands in view. Colt had told them before the first car arrived, stay visible, stay calm, hands where people can see them. The deputies spread out across the yard in the way that spoke of briefing, a practice deployment. 4 of them moved to contain the brothers before a single word was spoken. Sheriff Wade Gallagher got out of the lead vehicle. Gallagher was 54 years old, a 3rd-generation Millhaven man who had served in the department for 22 years and as sheriff for the last 8. He had a face that had been weathered by those years into something direct and unhurried. The kind of face that had seen enough of human behavior to have opinions about it without being surprised by it. He was not a man who enjoyed mornings like this one. He was not a man who disliked Colt Decker in the abstract. But the evidence on his desk had been clear, and evidence was what it was. He walked toward Colt with the warrant in his hand and the look of a man doing a job he was not relishing. The barn door was open behind Colt. He had been inside finishing the morning chores when he heard the vehicles on the road, and he had walked out of the barn the way he did, everything with his hands visible and his posture square. No running, no reaching, no aggression. Just a large man in a worn leather vest, standing in the yard of his farm. Gallagher stopped 6 feet away. "Colt Decker," he said. "Sheriff, I have got a warrant for your arrest. Equipment reported stolen from 2 neighboring properties has been located on your land." "I know what was located there," Colt said. "I called Ray last night when I saw it being dropped." Gallagher's expression did not change. "A deputy is going to place you in handcuffs." "I know." The deputy moved forward, and Colt put his hands out, wrists together, the practiced cooperation of a man who understood that this moment was not the one to fight. His brothers watched from across the yard, with their jaws set and their hands in plain sight. That was when the front door flew open. Hazel had been asleep. The sound of engines had pulled her up from sleep, and she had gone to the window and seen the vehicles and felt something drop in her chest that had nothing to do with her heart condition. She had come down the stairs in her boots and the flannel shirt, moving fast despite everything, pushing through the screen door and grabbing the porch rail when her legs decided they needed support. "Dad!" Her voice cut through all of it. The noise, the radio from one of the cruisers, the shuffling of boots on gravel. "What is happening?" He turned and looked at her, and in that single second, his face changed in a way that no amount of leather or ink could mask. It was the face of a man who was afraid not for himself, but for what this morning was costing the person he loved most. She looked at the deputies, at Gallagher, at the neighbors who had pulled over on the road with their phones up. Then she walked off the porch. He said her name low and careful, the way he said it when he needed her to hear it. She came to him and stowed there, and he could see her reading the situation, the cuffs on his wrists, the deputies on all sides, the crowd on the road. She was 20 years old, and she had never in her life looked so young. "Go back inside," he said. "No, Hazel." She looked at him, and her face did something he had only seen it do once before at her mother's funeral, when the weight of it finally exceeded what she could hold upright. Not crying, just breaking quietly without announcement. She turned into his chest, and her shoulders shook. He put his hands on the back of her head, both cuffed wrists raised, and held her there, and looked straight ahead over her hair at nothing. One of the deputies shifted. The deputy near them went quiet. Gallagher stood still. When the deputy gently separated them so the transport could proceed, Hazel stepped back and straightened her spine. She looked at her father. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe they are right about you. Maybe I am the reason your life never went anywhere." The deputy nearest them stopped moving for a second. Colt looked at his daughter for a long moment. "You are the reason my life has meaning." He said it the way people say things they have been certain of for years, without drama, without hesitation, as plain as weather. "That will not change." One of the brothers on the far side of the yard, Ray, turned away and stared at the tree line for a long time. The sheriff had been watching all of it. He had been watching the whole of it, the way Colt had come out of the barn, the way he had cooperated without a word of argument, the way he had stood with his cuffed hands raised to hold his daughter's head. And then Gallagher's eyes went to the vest. Not the patch on the back. Everyone had seen the patch on the back. It was the interior lining that caught the light when the vest shifted, a small emblem, sewn into the fabric near the left chest, faded and worn to the point of near illegibility. Round, dark blue and silver. A distinctive design that used a specific symbol Gallagher had not seen on a piece of clothing in 22 years. He had seen it once in a photograph. The photograph was on the nightstand on his wife's side of the bed, and it had been there until she died 4 years ago, when he had moved it to the drawer. Because looking at it every morning while her side of the bed remained empty was more than he could manage. The photograph was of a rescue scene, a flooded road, a partially submerged car, his wife Linda being helped up a muddy bank, their son Marcus, who had been 8 years old, being carried by a large man in a dark jacket. The man's face was partially obscured by the angle, but the emblem on his jacket was clear. The Millhaven Valley floods of 2001 had come in the night, which was why the road had been occupied by a single vehicle instead of a line of stopped traffic. Linda had been driving back from a church function, Marcus asleep in the back seat. The water had taken the road in a matter of minutes, the car going sideways and then sideways into the drainage ditch, and then the ditch had become part of the creek, and the creek had been moving fast. The man in the photograph had pulled Linda out first, gone back for Marcus, and broken 2 ribs in the process of getting the boy up the bank. He had declined to speak to the newspaper photographer who arrived with the rescue workers. He had been gone before the ambulance reached them. Linda had described him as large, quiet, methodical, like someone who had done this kind of work before. Gallagher had spent years, quiet and intermittent years, trying to find him. Linda, before she passed, had said that whoever that man was, he was the reason their family had any years after 2001. She had said it the way people say things that are completely true and that they have thought about many times. Gallagher looked at the emblem on the vest. He looked at Colt Decker. The size of him, the steadiness, the way he had stood in this yard with law enforcement closing in and shown no aggression, no flight, only a controlled calm that was the specific calm of someone trained to function under extreme pressure. He held up his hand. The deputy stopped moving. Gallagher did not speak for a moment. Then quietly, in a tone he kept low enough that only Colt could hear it clearly, he asked one question. Millhaven Valley, 2001. Were you there? Colt looked at him for a beat of silence. That was a long time ago, Colt said. That was all. That was enough. The arrest proceeded. Procedure was procedure, and the warrant was the warrant, and nothing that had just passed between them changed the legal reality of the moment. But something had changed. Gallagher felt it in his chest like a stone turning over. He watched Colt Decker get into the back of the vehicle, watched it pull away, watched Hazel standing on the porch with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, and he thought about a photograph in a drawer, and about 22 years, and about the kinds of debt that do not have paperwork. He was walking back to his vehicle when one of the younger deputies fell into step beside him. Garrett Flynn was 26 years old and 8 months into the job. He had the particular attentiveness of someone who had come to this work with genuine intention and had not yet had it worn down by repetition. He had been looking at the evidence file on this case since yesterday afternoon, and what he had been seeing had been bothering him in a way he could not entirely articulate, but could not ignore either. Sheriff, he said, I left a note on your desk this morning. Gallagher looked at him. About the evidence, Garrett said. The tire tracks near the shed do not match any vehicle registered to Decker. The soil on the equipment suggests it was moved onto the property recently, not stored there. And the timeline in Hoskins's witness statement does not match his own earlier account. Gallagher looked at the shed, at the marks in the dirt around it still visible from here if you were looking for them. You put all that in writing? This morning. I will read it when I get back. Garrett nodded and fell back. Gallagher got in his vehicle. He sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. Through the windshield, he could see Hazel still standing on the porch watching the cruiser that had taken her father. She had not moved. She was just standing there with that hand pressed against her chest, and even from here, even at this distance, something in her posture said that she was working very hard to stay on her feet. He thought about a woman on a muddy bank, about a boy being carried up out of rushing water in the arms of someone who had not asked whether it was worth the risk. He started the engine and pulled out. Behind him, Hazel Decker stood on the porch of her mother's farm and watched the last vehicle disappear around the bend in the road, and she did not go inside for a long time. In the hours after the vehicles left the farm went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. Hazel finally went back inside. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug she had not drunk from and looked at the pill cup on the counter that she had already taken this morning, as if needing to confirm that the normal things had still happened today. Ray came through the back door without knocking the way he always did, and he sat down across from her without asking permission. He poured himself a coffee from the pot on the counter. For a while, neither of them said anything. He did not do it, Hazel said. I know. He saw them last night. He called you. I know, Hazel. She looked at him. Ray Holden was the kind of man who people described as large, and left it there because large was the first word and covered a lot of the other words too. He was 51 years old with hands the size of dinner plates, and a voice that came from somewhere around floor level, and Hazel had known him since she was 7 years old. He had driven her to the emergency room at 2 a.m. once when her father's truck had a blown gasket, and there had been no one else to call, and he had sat in the plastic hospital chair for 5 hours without a word of complaint and without once making her feel like a burden. "What happens now?" she asked. "We find out what is on that equipment, where it came from. They are not going to just take his word for it." "No." Ray looked at his coffee. "But there are other kinds of words." She understood what he meant without him having to say more. The brothers were already working the problem each in their own way. Emmett, who had a background in insurance claims and understood documentation better than most, was photographing the tire tracks near the storage shed before they degraded. Calvin, who drove long haul and knew every independent mechanic in the county, was making calls about the equipment's origin. Tucker, whose land abutted the north property line, was asking his own quiet questions about what had been coming and going on the back access road. None of this would move as fast as Hazel wanted it to move. She knew that. She pressed her palm against the center of her chest, not in alarm, just out of habit, monitoring herself the way she always did when her body was under pressure. The cardiologist had been clear. Sustained stress was the enemy, not exertion, not activity, not even the physical demands of farm life. Those she managed. It was the low-grade constant pressure of uncertainty, the kind that lived in the background and never fully released, that did the particular damage her heart was susceptible to. She had been living in that kind of pressure for 6 weeks now. She knew what it was doing to her. She could feel it in the way she woke up in the mornings, the slight heaviness, the rhythm that was off by just enough to make her aware of it. She thought about what her father had said in the yard. "You are the reason my life has meaning." She had said that terrible thing to him, the thing about his life being stuck. She had said it from a place of guilt that had been building for 3 years since the diagnosis, since she had understood that her father had reorganized his entire existence around her continued survival. She had said it because part of her believed it, and she hated that she believed it, and she hated that he had answered it with such absolute certainty that she could not hold on to the belief anymore. Ray was watching her. "Stop," he said quietly. "Stop what?" "Whatever you are doing, stop it." She looked at him. "He is in a cell because of me. He is in a cell because someone planted evidence on his property." Ray set down his mug. "You are two different things. Do not make them the same thing." She looked at the window. Outside, the yard was empty, and still the gravel disturbed by 6 sets of tires and a dozen pairs of boots. "He called you last night," she said, "when he saw the truck." "He called me. He did not go out there alone." "No." "He knew," she said, and she meant something by that. Not just that he had known the evidence was planted, but that he had known, with the prescience of a man trained to read escalating situations, that this moment was coming. He had seen it coming and prepared for it and walked into it with his hands up and his eyes clear. She thought about the pill cup on the counter this morning, arranged the same way it was every single morning before dawn while she was still asleep. 20 years of her father showing up before she knew she needed him. Long before she had a diagnosis. Long before a cardiologist used the word permanent. "How long has he been doing this?" she said. She did not specify what. Ray seemed to understand. He looked at his coffee for a moment. "Since before you knew to look for it," he said. She was quiet. "The county is going to have to process this," Ray said. "They will look at the evidence. Garrett Flynn, the young deputy, he is a straight shooter. He noticed some things. He put it in writing." "You know him." "I know his uncle. Good family." Ray stood up. "This is going to take a day or two. Your job is to be here and be okay." "I hate that that is my job." "I know, do it anyway." She almost smiled. He carried his mug to the sink, rinsed it, set it in the rack. He moved around her kitchen with the ease of a man who had been in it hundreds of times. At the back door, he paused. "He said it out there," Ray said, not quite looking at her. "What he said to you, I want you to know he meant it. I have known him 20 years. He does not say things he does not mean." She looked at her hands around the mug. "I know," she said. Ray went out. The screen door settled closed behind him with its familiar sound. Hazel sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. Eventually, she got up and went to the refrigerator and looked at the sticky notes on the door. Each one in her father's handwriting. Each one a piece of the infrastructure he had built around her life to keep it running. Dosage schedules, appointment dates, emergency contacts. The cardiologist's after-hours number underlined twice. She stood there reading them the way she sometimes did as a reminder of something she had difficulty holding on to when things were difficult. Then she refilled her coffee, went to the couch, opened her laptop, and started looking for legal resources on evidence tampering in Tennessee. She was 20 years old and stubborn in all the best ways. If her body was going to limit what she could do physically, then she was going to find other ways to be useful. She had her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, and neither of those people had ever stayed down when there was still a thing to be done. She started reading. Outside on the road that ran past the farm, a car slowed and then continued on. On the ridge to the east, a hawk rode a thermal without effort, turning wide circles above the valley that had been this family's home for 3 generations and that someone somewhere was trying very hard to take away. The land held. The hills were the same hills they had always been. The creek still ran. The orchard on the western slope, the one Donna had refused to touch, was coming into the first of its autumn colors, the pears turning, and the light through the leaves, the color of old honey. Colt Decker was not there to see it this morning, but the farm knew he was coming back. The farm had that kind of memory. The fence lines he had walked for years, the barn he had repaired board by board, the kitchen where he had been getting up before dawn since his wife died to make sure the one person left in the world who needed him was taken care of. Some things could not be bought. Some things could not be moved. This was one of them. And in the county holding facility 12 miles south of the farm, Colt Decker sat in a chair with his forearms on his knees and his face in his hands, and he thought about Hazel on the porch, and he thought about the look on Gallagher's face when he had asked that question, and he thought about a night in 2001 when the water had been very cold and the current had been very strong, and he had gone in anyway because there had been no one else to go. He had not talked about that night in years. He did not talk about it for the same reason he did not talk about a lot of the things he had done in his life before the farm, before Donna, before everything became small and specific and necessary. Because those things were not the point. The point was what came after. The point was the morning routine and the pill cup and the sticky notes and the way Hazel looked when she laughed, which was with her whole body the same way Donna had laughed and which made the whole room feel brighter when it happened. That was the point. He was going to hold on to that point. He was going to hold on to it until he walked back up that driveway, and then he was going to go inside and warm up whatever Hazel had attempted to make for dinner, and they were going to sit at the kitchen table the way they always did, and whatever came next, they would face it from that table together. He closed his eyes. 12 miles north, the farm waited. Garrett Flynn was not the kind of person who showed up in stories the way dramatic figures did, striding in with revelations. He was 26 years old and worked methodically, and what he was doing the morning after Colt's arrest was simply reading his own notes and then reading the evidence file and then reading his own notes again. The tire tracks near the storage shed had been documented by the first deputy on scene. Standard procedure, photographs, measurements, notation of the direction of approach. Garrett had those photographs in front of him. He had in a separate folder the registered vehicle records for every truck and trailer associated with the Decker property. He was comparing tread patterns. The tracks near the shed were from a commercial flatbed with a tread width measurement that corresponded to a mid-sized commercial truck with dual rear wheels. None of the vehicles registered to Colt or the Iron Valley Riders Club garage matched that specification. This was not on its own definitive. Vehicles got borrowed. Rental trucks existed, but it was a discrepancy, and discrepancies were what you looked for. The soil disturbance was the second thing. Standard agricultural soil, the kind found throughout the valley, showed characteristic signs of being turned or disturbed within a specific time frame. The soil on and around the dropped equipment was disturbed in a pattern consistent with recent relocation. Not stored equipment, moved equipment. The disturbance pattern included a lack of the weathering and compaction that built up on equipment sitting outdoors for more than a few days. This equipment had not been on the Decker property for more than a few days. The third thing was the witness. A man named Hoskins, who farmed about 2 miles east, had given a statement asserting that he had seen a truck he associated with Iron Valley Riders pulling what appeared to be a trailer down the back access road at approximately 11:30 on the night in question. Garrett pulled both statements Hoskins had given. The initial one recorded the day the complaint was filed, and the follow-up given the morning of the arrest. In the initial statement, Hoskins gave the time as between 11 and midnight and described the truck as dark-colored with possible club insignia on the back window. In the follow-up statement, Hoskins was more specific. He gave the time as 11:15 to 11:30 and added that he had seen the driver's face and recognized it as consistent with someone he had seen at the Decker farm previously. The initial statement had been given at 3 in the afternoon, 12 hours after the supposed event. The follow-up had been given 2 days later after a visit from a Roth Capital attorney who had also visited 2 other neighboring property owners in the same period. Garrett sat with this for a while. He wrote 4 pages of notes. He organized them into categories. Then he walked to the copier, made 2 copies of everything sealed. 1 copy in an envelope with his initials across the sealed flap, and delivered the other copy to the sheriff's office with a cover note that was precise and professional and that made the discrepancies very clear. The original he filed in his own desk. Then he went back to work. Gallagher read Garrett's note at 6:45 in the morning, standing at his desk, before he sat down the way he did with things that needed his full attention. He read it twice. He set it on the desk. He looked at the wall for a moment, then looked back at the note. He was thinking about the photograph in the drawer. He was thinking about the arrest warrant he had signed, and the evidence he had signed it on, and the question he had asked in the farmyard, and the answer that had not been an answer, but that had been sufficient. He sat down at his desk and pulled up the county property records. He started reading. Dale Carver had not sold his property and had no intention of doing so, but he was not stupid, and he had been watching what happened to the people who said no long enough to understand that his own vulnerability was not zero. He was 67 years old, a widower with no children, local enough to help him if things went sideways. He had been approached twice by Roth's representatives. Both times he had listened politely and sent them back to their car. After the second approach, he had started keeping records. The emails had come to him indirectly through a chain of acquaintance he would not fully explain to the sheriff when the time came, because explaining it completely would involve naming someone who had taken a considerable personal risk to pass the information along and who had family in the valley. He would say only that the information had come to him from a source with direct access to Roth Capital Communications and that he had verified the email headers against the company's known domain before printing anything. He had 17 emails, printed on paper, kept in a locked metal box in the locked storage compartment of his truck, because Dale Carver was old enough to know that digital things disappear and that physical things were harder to delete. The emails covered a period of approximately 8 months. They were between a Roth Capital regional director named Philip Morse and a contact identified only by a phone number that Dale had been unable to trace. The content described in business-like language a sequence of actions designed to create conditions under which specific holdout landowners would face legal and financial pressures sufficient to make selling preferable to continued resistance. The language was careful. It did not say damage the fence or poison the animals or plant stolen equipment. It used terms like property condition events and community confidence measures and third-party verification development. But the sequence described corresponded precisely in timing and in nature to what had happened on the Decker farm over the past 6 weeks. There were also 3 emails that referenced prior projects in other counties by code names that Dale had spent several evenings cross-referencing against public records. 2 of them matched development projects that had been controversial in their respective counties. One of them matched a case where a farming family had lost their property after a legal proceeding that, reading between the lines of Dale's notes, had involved testimony that looked different now than it had at the time. Dale had been sitting on this box for 3 weeks. He had been waiting to be certain. He was a deliberate man who did not act until he was certain. The morning of Colt's arrest, he was certain. He drove to the county sheriff's office that afternoon and asked to speak with the sheriff directly. He had his box under his arm. He had already made a copy of everything in it and mailed it to his lawyer in Knoxville the previous evening. The deputy at the front desk told him the sheriff was not available. Dale said he would wait. He waited for 2 hours. Gallagher came out of a meeting at 3:15 and found Dale Carver sitting in the plastic chair in the waiting area, a metal box on his lap, looking like a man who had been waiting for 2 hours and intended to wait 2 more if necessary. Gallagher took him into his office and closed the door. He read for 45 minutes. Dale sat in the chair across the desk and did not say anything while Gallagher read. When Gallagher looked up, his face had the expression of a man who had just seen a large portion of the ground shift under his feet. "How long have you had this?" he asked. 3 weeks, Dale said. Gallagher looked at him. "I wanted to be sure," Dale said. Gallagher looked back at the emails. He thought about the arrest warrant he had signed based on evidence that someone had spent significant effort and money to fabricate. He thought about Garrett Flynn's note about tire tracks and soil disturbance. He thought about a witness whose second statement had been given after a visit from a Roth Capital attorney. He reached for his phone. The first call was to the county prosecutor, a woman named Harmon who had been in the office for 11 years and who Gallagher respected without reservation. She told him not to do anything else until she could have a conversation with a state investigator she had worked with on a fraud case 2 years prior. The second call was to that investigator directly. The conversation lasted 32 minutes. At 5:15 that evening, Colt Decker was released from the county holding facility on the grounds that the basis for his arrest was under formal review, pending investigation. He was met in the parking lot by Ray, who was leaning against the passenger side of his truck, with his arms folded as if he had simply been waiting for a bus. Colt walked over. They looked at each other. "How is Hazel?" Colt asked. "Holding," Ray said. "She built a legal document." Colt blinked. "Organized evidence by category. Called a pro bono attorney. Sent them a summary." Ray opened the passenger door. "Get in." She made dinner. They drove north in the late afternoon light through the valley past the farms that had been signed away and the farms that had held past the tree lines that ran along the creek past the back road where a truck with no lights had moved equipment in the dark. The mountains in the east were going amber in the late sun. Colt did not say anything for most of the drive. "Who called you?" he asked finally. "Gallagher's office." He was quiet. "The deputy?" "Flynn, he sent a note." Colt looked out the window. "Kid is sharp," Ray said. "He is." They pulled into the driveway. The farm looked the way it always looked, unchanged, present the barn. In the late light, the house with the porch light on, because it was always on when Colt was expected home. He sat in the truck for a moment after Ray cut the engine. "She is not going to say I told you so," Ray said. "I know. She is just gonna have made dinner." Colt got out of the truck. Hazel was in the kitchen when he came through the back door. She looked up from the stove where she was heating something, and her expression did the thing it always did when she was trying not to show how much she had been worried, which was to become very focused on the thing she was doing. "Soup," she said, "from the freezer." "Sounds good." She took the lid off the pot. He came and stood next to her and looked in the pot, and for a moment they stood side by side in the kitchen, the way they always had, the way that felt completely ordinary, and that he had understood for 3 years was the most extraordinary thing in his life. "You built a legal document," he said. "Someone had to." "I saw it." She looked at him sideways. "Ray sent it to you." From the parking lot, she turned back to the soup. "It is organized by category. The tire track discrepancy is section 2. I saw that too." She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her doing the thing she did when she was deciding whether to say the thing she was thinking. "They are not done," she said. "No. Roth is not going to just stop because the arrest fell apart." "No. So what happens now?" He got 2 bowls from the cabinet and set them on the counter beside her. "Now we eat dinner, and then we figure out the next part." She ladled the soup. They sat at the kitchen table the way they always did, side by side, rather than across from each other, which was a thing that had started when she was 9 years old and had not stopped. Outside the kitchen window, the last of the daylight was going, the valley going purple, and then gray, the tree line on the ridge becoming a silhouette. "Gallagher asked me something," Colt said when they were partway through the soup. She looked at him. "Before they took me in, he asked me about 2001, the Millhaven floods." She was still. "There was something on the inside of my vest, the old Rescue Corps patch." He recognized it. Colt looked at his bowl. His wife was in a car in the flood, with his son. "I pulled them out." Hazel set her spoon down. "He had been looking for whoever did it for 22 years, Colt said. "His wife died 4 years ago. He said she used to say that whoever it was, they were the reason the family had more years together." She looked at him for a long time. "Why did you never tell anyone?" He looked at her the way he looked at things he had thought about carefully. "Because it was one night, and it was the bomb, and afterward there was everything else." He picked up his spoon. It did not feel like something to talk about. 22 years, she said. It was his story, not mine. She was quiet for a while. He ate. She watched him eat with the expression she sometimes had, the one that mixed something like love with something like frustration, with something like deep recognition. "You are the most stubborn person I have ever met," she said. He almost smiled. "Where do you think you got it?" She picked up her spoon. "You should have told me." "I know." They ate in silence for a while, the comfortable silence of 2 people who had spent enough time together to find quiet easy. Outside, a night bird started up somewhere in the orchard. The creak was audible through the cracked window. 3 days after Colt's release, Roth made his next move. It came through the newspaper. A letter to the editor appeared signed by a name Colt did not recognize. expressing general concern about the public health implications of an active investigation near farms that supplied the local food chain. The letter was generic enough to be unprovable as targeted, but it referenced obliquely a situation involving a property under scrutiny, and it included language that made a reader's eye go immediately to the Decker farm because there was no other farm under active scrutiny in the valley. The same afternoon, a woman Hazel had gone to high school with sent her a screenshot of a social media post on a community page. The post from an account Hazel did not recognize asked in sympathetic language whether people in the valley knew that one of the holdout properties had a current legal matter and whether that might affect property values. Hazel showed Colt. He read both items without expression. "Forward the screenshot to the attorney," he said. "Already did." He looked at her. She looked back. "They are trying to isolate us," she said. "Make the neighbors uncomfortable. Make the community see the legal situation as a contamination." Yes, they did this somewhere else. There is a reference in email 14. She had been through Dale's emails twice now with the attorney's permission. In a county in East Tennessee 3 years ago, they ran a similar community perception campaign against a holdout family. A seed supply company pulled their commercial credit 6 weeks later, citing reputational concerns. Colt was quiet. "We do not have a seed supplier anymore," she said. "We switched to direct purchase 2 years ago because the credit terms were better. But other people in the valley do." "Yes." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. "You have been reading those emails carefully." "I have been very busy," she said with a precise dryness that was entirely her mother's. He went to his phone and called the attorney. The conversation lasted 25 minutes. When he came back to the table, Hazel had already started a new section in the document. "Section 5, she said, "Community Perception Campaign. Documented instances, timeline correlating evidence from email 14. He sat down. "Section 6, she said, "Seed Credit Withdrawal Pattern. Still compiling." He looked at her. She was pale. She had been pale for 3 days, the particular pallor of someone running on adrenaline and will. Her hands on the keyboard were steady, but he had seen them trembling last night when she thought he was not looking, the fine motor tremor that showed up when her system was overtaxed. "Hazel," he said, "I am fine. You are not sleeping." She stopped typing. "I am sleeping. 4 hours, maybe 5. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The same eyes that had always looked at him with the particular precision of someone who knew exactly who he was. "You did not sleep for 3 years after Mom died," she said. "I know. You said you were fine every time I asked." "I know. Were you?" He was quiet. "Then do not ask me that question," she said. She went back to the document. He sat with that for a moment. Then he reached over and gently closed the laptop. She looked at him. "Eat something," he said, "then sleep for a real amount of time. The document will be there tomorrow." "We do not have time. We have time for you to sleep. You do not know that. I know that if your heart goes into crisis in the middle of all this, the document does not matter. I do not matter. The land does not matter." He looked at her with the directness he almost never deployed because he did not need to. "None of it matters if you are not in it." She looked at the closed laptop. Her jaw was set. 6 hours, she said. "I will eat and then 6 hours. 7, 6.5. He got up to make dinner. It was Ray who told him about the 2 brothers. Roth's people had approached them quietly on separate days with an offer that was simple and specific. Not to buy anything. To provide a statement when the time came that they had witnessed certain things on the Decker property in recent months that would be consistent with the story Roth's legal team needed to tell. The offer included a number, a decent number. Both men had declined. Both men had called Ray within 24 hours of being approached. Ray told Colt on the phone and Colt listened, and when Ray was done, he said, "They are getting desperate." Or impatient, Ray said. Same thing with men like Roth. The attempt to buy witness statements was the mistake. It was documented the moment both men declined because both men separately and without coordinating wrote down what had been said and who had said it and what number had been offered and signed and dated those accounts. Both accounts were in Ray's truck within 48 hours. Both accounts were in the attorney's file 48 hours after that. The attorney read them and called Colt. "This changes the civil case significantly," as she said. "Attempted witness tampering in the context of an ongoing investigation gives us a direct line to Roth Capital that the emails alone do not provide. The emails use careful language. This does not." Colt said he understood. "I need to notify the state investigator," she said. "Do it." She did. Gallagher got a call from the state investigator the following morning. The conversation was brief and pointed. The investigator told him that things were moving and that the timeline for formal action was narrowing. Gallagher said he understood. He did not ask for details he was not cleared to receive. He went back to his office and sat for a while before picking up any other work. He thought about Dale's emails, about the 3 families in other counties who had been put through versions of what Colt was going through, about a farming family in East Tennessee that had lost everything to a fabricated legal case. He thought about Garrett Flynn's report, about the deputy who had sat in the waiting area with his careful notes and asked for 5 minutes of the sheriff's time. He thought about the photograph, about Linda, about Marcus, who was 31 years old now, living in Knoxville with his wife and 2 kids, who still called his father every Sunday. He picked up the phone and called the county prosecutor. They talked for a long time. It was Hazel who finally slept the 7 hours on the 4th night, and it was Colt who sat at the kitchen table alone after midnight and let himself feel briefly and privately how tired he was. Not physically, though he was physically tired. The other kind of tired. The kind that came from sustained vigilance, from the posture of readiness that he had been carrying for 6 weeks and that he did not know how to set down while the threat was still present. He thought about the letter he had burned, the zeros on that check. He understood in the cold and private honesty of 2 in the morning what that number would have meant. The medical debt, the equipment, the ability to breathe without the farm's thin margins always in the background. He understood it with the full arithmetic of a man who knew exactly what he owed and what he earned. He had still burned it. He would still burn it. Not because he was noble, not because nobility was a thing he thought about or aspired to, but because some things were not for sale, and one of them was the creek in the lower field, and one of them was the orchard on the western slope, and one of them was the specific fact of his daughter growing up on the land her mother had grown up on, with the same view of the eastern ridge from the kitchen window, the same particular light in October, the same smell in the barn that connected her to every generation of people who had loved this place before her. He could not sell that. It was not possible. He got up and went to the window. The valley was dark and still the hills black against the sky, the creek barely audible from here, but present, always present. He pressed his hand flat against the glass. Then he went to bed. The phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. It was the attorney. The state investigator executed a warrant last night, she said. Roth Capital offices in Nashville, preliminary to formal charges. Colt stood in the kitchen in his work clothes, the coffee not yet made, the house still dark around him. How long, he said. Days, maybe a week. It moves fast once warrants are executed. She paused. You should know that Knox Slater was located this morning. He is cooperating. Slater cooperating. That meant the contractor who had cut the fence and poisoned the animals and moved the equipment onto the property was now talking to investigators about who had paid him and what he had been asked to do. And the civil complaint, Colt asked. We filed for summary dismissal yesterday. I expect it to be granted within the week. He stood in the dark kitchen and breathed. Mr. Decker, the attorney said, I want you to understand that this is still a legal process. Nothing is concluded, but the situation has changed materially. I understand. Get some rest. I will call you when there is more. He put the phone down. Behind him from the top of the stairs, Hazel's voice came down. Dad? He looked up. She was standing at the top of the stairs in her flannel shirt, her hair loose, the monitor clipped to her collar. She had clearly been awake for the phone call. Was that the attorney? Yes. And he looked at her for a moment. Slater is cooperating, he said. She stood very still at the top of the stairs. Then she sat down on the top step, which was something she had done since she was small, sitting on the top step when she needed to think or when something had happened that required time to absorb. He waited. Okay, she said finally. Yeah. So now we wait. Now we wait. She looked at him from the top of the stairs. In the gray light of the early morning, with the house quiet and the valley still outside and the coffee not yet made, she looked young in a way she rarely looked anymore. She looked the way she had looked when she was 17, and the cardiologist had used the word permanent, and she had sat very still for a long time before she had looked at her father and said, okay, what do we do now? He had told her then the same thing he told her now, with the same steadiness that was not the absence of fear, but the management of it. We keep going, he said, just like we have been. She looked at him for another moment. Then she stood up. I will start the coffee, she said. I've got the animals. She went to the kitchen. He put on his jacket and went out to the barn. The morning was cold and clear, the sky above the eastern ridge going from black to deep blue to the first pale gray of coming dawn. His breath came out in clouds. The grass was wet. The barn doors opened on their tracks with the familiar sound he had heard 10,000 times. The horses shifted at his approach. He fed them. He checked the water. He ran his hand along Calhoun's neck, and the horse leaned into it slightly, the way he did. And for a moment, Colt just stood there in the warm smell of the barn, his hand on the horse's neck, the pale morning light beginning to show through the gaps in the siding. Whatever was coming, it was coming. The land would still be here. So would he. Gallagher drove out to the farm that afternoon. He came alone. No uniform. He pulled up the driveway in his personal truck and sat in it for a moment before getting out, looking at the farmhouse, the way a man looks at a place he has been thinking about. Colt was on the porch when he walked up. He had seen the truck come up the road from the barn window and had come out without particular urgency, the way he came out to meet everything now directly and without preparation. Gallagher stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. They looked at each other. "I owe you an apology," Gallagher said. "A real one." Colt was quiet for a moment. "You were doing your job. I was doing it with my eyes half closed." Gallagher held his gaze. "That is different. The evidence was planted, and I should have asked harder questions before I signed that warrant." "The evidence was done well," Colt said. "Garrett asked the hard questions. He is 26 years old." Gallagher's jaw tightened. "I should have asked them at 48. Colt looked at him for a long time. Then he moved on the porch step, making space. "Come up," he said. Gallagher came up. They stood on the porch for a while looking at the valley. The afternoon light was long and flat, the kind of late-season light that made everything look like it was being seen for the last time before winter. "I spent years looking for you," Gallagher said finally. "I know, I heard." Gallagher looked at him. "You heard. Small county." The sheriff was quieted for a moment. "Linda used to say you were the reason we had any years after 2001. She said it a lot." He paused. "She died 4 years ago. Fast, same as everything. She never knew." Colt looked at the valley. "I am sorry," he said. "She would have wanted to know." Gallagher looked at his hands. "She would have wanted to say thank you." Colt was quiet. Then, "She raised a good son. I heard Marcus coaches youth football in Knoxville." Gallagher looked at him. "Small county," Colt said again almost gently. Gallagher made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He put his hands in his pockets. Behind them, the screen door opened. Hazel appeared in the doorway with a glass of water in each hand, looking between the two men with her characteristic watchfulness. "Sheriff," she said. "Miss Decker." Gallagher's voice was careful. "How are you doing?" "Better than last week," she said. She came out and handed them each a glass. She stood in the doorway, not quite joining them in her particular way of being present without inserting herself. "Your father tells me Slater is cooperating," Gallagher said. "The attorney told us this morning." "Then things should move quickly now." Hazel looked at him steadily. "Thank you for reading Garrett's report." Gallagher looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. "That took longer than it should have." "It took exactly long enough," she said. "Not unkind, just precise. It happened." He nodded. They stood on the porch, the three of them in the afternoon light, with the valley spread below them, and the ridge to the east already in early shadow, and the creek audible if you were quiet enough to hear it. Some apologies could not undo what had happened. Gallagher knew that. Colt knew it. Hazel, who had spent 3 days building a legal document while her father sat in a cell 12 miles away, knew it most specifically. But some apologies were still necessary, and this one had been said and received, and that was something. The state investigators worked the way institutional processes work, methodically without drama, one documented step at a time. Slater's cooperation opened the accounting. He had been paid through 3 separate holding companies, each incorporated in a different state, each with a filing address that traced back to a mail service rather than a physical office. It was the kind of structure that took work to build and that looked from a distance like impenetrable architecture. It was not impenetrable, it was just thorough. The investigators found one transaction that could be traced completely, one account that had a name attached to it, one wire transfer with a timestamp, and a routing number that could be matched against Roth Capital's internal records. Slater knew which transactions to point to. He had kept records of his own, which surprised the investigators less than it might have surprised someone unfamiliar with contractors in his line of work. Men who did what Slater did tended to keep records, not because they intended to cooperate, but because records were insurance, a guarantee that if someone tried to burn them, they had enough to burn back. The warrant that had been executed at Roth Capital's Nashville office had yielded servers physical files in the personal calendar of Philip Morse Roth's regional director, which contained meetings with no business context at locations off the company books, with parties whose names corresponded to burner phone numbers in Slater's own records. The county prosecutor reviewed the material methodically. She identified the specific charge architecture. She divided the work. On a Thursday morning, Victor Roth was arrested at his office in Nashville. He came out in a suit. He was composed. He had a lawyer on his phone before the investigators finished reading him his rights. He said nothing except that he was cooperating fully and had full confidence in the legal process, which was the statement his lawyer had told him to make, and that he delivered with the smooth conviction of a man who had given many prepared statements in his professional life. Knox Slater had already been processed and arraigned and was in the custody of the state. Philip Morse, the regional director, had cooperated before his arrest, which was a distinction that would matter for the sentencing range, but did not change the nature of what he had done. The civil complaint against Colt was dismissed with prejudice 2 days after Roth's arrest on the grounds that it had been filed without merit as part of a coordinated campaign of harassment. The dismissal order included language that was specific and clear about the nature of the filing language that the attorney had asked for and that the judge had included without hesitation. Colt was in the barn when the attorney called. He listened. He said, "Understood, thank you." He put the phone back in his pocket and stood with his hand on Calhoun's neck for a moment. Then he went back to what he had been doing. The two farming families who had sold under duress received letters from the county prosecutor's office within the week. Restitution proceedings were complicated in situations like this because the properties had already been transferred and the corporate structure that had bought them was now under legal proceedings that froze its assets. But there were mechanisms. It would take time. It would not be complete. But something was possible, and the prosecutor was committed to pursuing it. The family that had lost everything to a fabricated legal case retained an attorney the following Monday. That attorney told the family, "You have a case. It is going to be a hard one. I am not going anywhere." They had shaken his hand. Millhaven did not organize anything for Colt. That was not how the town worked, and Colt would not have wanted it if it had. He was not a man who required public acknowledgement of things that had been done. He was a man who required his land, his daughter, his horses, and his morning routine. He had all four. The investigation's aftermath moved through the valley the way spring moves through cold ground underneath, first, then visible, then undeniable. The county prosecutor worked 3 separate case files simultaneously: the criminal proceeding against Roth and Morse, the restitution claims for the families who had been coerced into selling, and a civil rights complaint on behalf of the family whose legal case had been fabricated. She worked them in parallel with the patience of someone who understood that justice was a thing that took time and that taking time did not mean abandoning the work. Roth's legal team was excellent. They filed motions. They requested delays. They challenged the admissibility of Slater's cooperation testimony on procedural grounds that went nowhere but took weeks to dismiss. They were doing what excellent legal teams did, which was to use the machinery of the process to extend it. The prosecutor did not rush. She did not express frustration. She did the next thing that needed doing, and then the next thing, and then the next. Colt followed the case in the newspaper and through his attorney and through the quiet updates that Gallagher passed along in the way that Gallagher had started passing things along, not as official communications, but as the kind of conversation that happened between two people who had established over time and difficulty a particular understanding. He did not call the prosecutor. He did not attend proceedings. He trusted his attorney to tell him what mattered and trusted the process to move in the direction the evidence pointed, which was where good evidence in the hands of a committed prosecutor eventually moved. His job was the farm. His job was the morning routine. He did his job. What he did not know until a late November day when Hazel came into the barn with her coat on and her laptop under her arm was that she had been corresponding with 2 of the families whose cases were being handled by the prosecutor's office. She had found them through the public court filings. She had reached out to say simply that she was the daughter of one of the affected parties and that if it was useful, she would be happy to share any of the documentation she had compiled during the investigation. Both families had written back. One of them, the family whose fabricated legal case had cost them their property, had been in correspondence with her for 3 weeks. The wife, a woman named Carol, had 2 sons, 11 and 14 years old. She had described in her second email what it had been like to explain to the boys why the farm was gone. She had used language that was specific and unsparing, the language of someone who had been processing something for a long time and was finally describing it to someone who could receive it. Hazel had written back in kind. Colt read the email chain in the barn with Hazel standing nearby watching him read. He got through all of it. Then he was quiet for a while. "You did not tell me about this," he said. "I did not want to until I knew if it was going to be useful." "Is it?" Their attorney says the documentation adds context to the pattern of behavior claim. "The way it was done to us, the escalation sequence matches what was done to them closely enough that it supports the argument that this was a deliberate operating procedure, not a one-time decision. That strengthens their case." He handed the laptop back. "Good," he said. She looked at him. "You are not going to tell me I should have said something earlier. Would it have changed what you did?" "No." "Then what would be the point?" He turned back to the horse's water. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment. "Carol asked if we would be willing to testify if it comes to that," she said. He turned back. "Yes," he said. "I told her that. She said to tell you she appreciated it." Hazel looked at her laptop, then at her father. "She said her boys asked her once who the people were who were still fighting. She told them about us. She said the older one asked what kind of person keeps fighting when it costs that much." She paused. "She told him the kind that has already paid the cost before and knows what it buys." Colt looked at her. Hazel closed the laptop. "I thought you should know," she said. She went back to the house. He stood in the barn alone for a while. The horses shifted. The late November cold came through the siding. Outside, the light was the flat gray of clouds coming in from the north. He thought about Carol's boys, 11 and 14. He thought about what it would feel like to explain to a child why the place they had grown up in was gone. He thought about Hazel at 17, sitting down next to him at the kitchen table before dawn, the morning after Donna died, not saying anything, just sitting there. Some things people carried. Some things carried people. The difference between those two categories was not always visible from the outside. He went back to work. The snows came in December, as they always did, light at first, and then with more commitment, the valley going white and quiet in the way it went white and quiet every year. Colt got up in the dark and fed the horses and broke the ice in the water troughs and checked the cattle in the lower pasture. He made the coffee and the breakfast and the pill cup. He put the sticky notes back on the refrigerator when they faded and replaced them with new ones in the same positions. The farm was the same farm. The morning was the same morning. The diner on Main Street started keeping a back table open on Saturdays for Iron Valley. Not announced, just done. The owner's name was Bobby Mercer, and he had grown up in the valley and had known privately for years that the men in those vests were not the threat they appeared to be. He had watched Ray Holden fix a stranger's flat tire in the rain outside his diner in August and say nothing about it and drive away. He had watched Colt Decker sit with old Herschel Watts for 2 hours in the corner booth after Herschel's wife died, just sitting, not talking much, just there. He had put these things together over time and come to a conclusion. He put a reserved card on the back table. The first Saturday it was there, Ray looked at it for a long moment before he sat down. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson had received 3 months of anonymous water bill payments the previous year, which she had attempted to understand and eventually attributed to the County Assistance Program in the absence of any other explanation. She was 74 years old and had lived in the valley her whole life. When she finally determined through a conversation at the hardware store that she had not intended to have, but that had given her the information anyway, that the payments had come from Colt Decker, she drove directly to her kitchen and made an apple pie. She drove it out to the farm on a Wednesday afternoon. Colt was in the south field. She left the pie on the porch with a note that said, "Only thank you." He found it when he came in for lunch. He stood on the porch holding the pie for a moment before he took it inside. He cut 2 pieces. He called Hazel down from upstairs. They sat at the kitchen table and ate the pie without any particular ceremony, and afterward Hazel said, "That is from Mrs. Patterson," not as a question. "Yes." "The water bill?" "Yes." She looked at it. "Yes." "How many of those are there?" He looked at the pie. "A few," he said. She shook her head slowly. Not in frustration. In the particular mix of exasperation and recognition that she reserved for the specific variety of his stubbornness that manifested as anonymous kindness. "You are the most difficult man," she said. He took another bite of pie. It needed doing. So did telling someone about it. That is not how it works. She looked at the ceiling briefly. I am going to find out every single one and send thank you notes. That would defeat the purpose. I do not care. He almost smiled. Gallagher gave his public statement at the monthly town council meeting on the second Tuesday of October. Colt had been invited. He had not attended, which Gallagher had anticipated and did not hold against him. The statement was not for Colt's benefit. The statement was for the benefit of the people in that room who had believed what they had believed about a man based on what he wore on his back and who needed to hear it said aloud in an official context that they had been wrong. Gallagher said it. He was specific. He named assumptions. He named the quality of evidence he had relied on and the quality of scrutiny he had not applied. He talked about the difference between a man's appearance and his character, and he said that difference was something he had known for 22 years and had still failed to apply in this specific situation, and that failure was his and no one else's. The room was quiet while he spoke. What came out after, quietly through a conversation that Gallagher had not planned, was the last piece of Colt Decker's story that most people in Millhaven had not known. The Veterans Outreach Coordinator for Millhaven County was a woman named Sandra Howell, who maintained, among other things, a fund for struggling veterans' families and members of established fraternal organizations who had hit hard times. For 9 years, a recurring anonymous donor had been making small contributions. $50, sometimes $100, irregular timing, no name attached. 9 years. Going back to a period when Colt had been on a payment plan with the medical billing department of the county hospital. When the farm had been operating on margins that did not allow for significant discretionary spending. When he had been, by any external measure, a man who had nothing left over. When Gallagher went looking and the connection was made, Sandra sat with those records for a long time before she said anything. Then she looked at Gallagher across her desk. The strongest people rarely announce themselves, she said. Gallagher said nothing. He just nodded. Autumn came fully into the valley. The orchard on the western slope turned, the pears going first and the apples following, the whole slope going from green to gold to the deep red-orange. That only happened in the 2 weeks before first frost. Colt walked up to the orchard on a Saturday morning in mid-October and stood in it for a long time looking at the light through the leaves. The smell was the same smell it had been every October since the first October he had walked here 19 years ago, when Donna had brought him up the slope to show him what the place looked like in the second week of the month. She had said, "This is why you cannot sell it without any particular drama, just as a statement of fact." He had not understood then, not fully, not the way he understood it now. He picked up 2 of the fallen pears and put them in his jacket pocket and walked back down. Hazel was at the kitchen table when he came in, laptop open, tea at her elbow. She had an online class in 10 minutes. She was studying agricultural management, which she had put off for 2 years because the energy had not been there and the circumstances had not allowed for it, in which she had enrolled in 3 weeks ago, with the specific, focused decisiveness of a person who had been waiting for a door to open. "Orchard is coming in," he said. She looked up. "Good year." "Good year," he said, the pears on the counter. "For you." She looked at them. Her face did something he recognized. The particular movement that she had inherited from her mother. The thing that happened in the eyes when something ordinary was also unexpectedly moving. "I will make preserves," she said. "I know." He poured coffee. He sat at the table across from her. The class start screen was up on her laptop, showing a waiting room with 2 other students' names. She had her notebook open, pen at hand, the preparedness of a person who took what she was doing seriously. "How is the class going?" he said. "Good. The soil management module is actually interesting." She glanced at him. "You did not think it would be interesting." "I did not say that. You had the face." "I do not have a face." She gave him a look that was entirely her mother's. The class started. He went out to the barn. He worked for an hour on Calhoun's shoes. Then he heard the bikes on the road. They came in a line the way they always came, 22 of them. The sound of the engines building from a distant rumble to the full rolling sound that filled the yard when they turned in. He came out of the barn and stood in the doorway and watched them come up the drive, Ray leading, then the others behind him, in the loose formation they always rode in. It was Saturday, but today there were more of them than usual. All 22, not a weekend ride, something else. Ray pulled in first and cut his engine and sat for a moment looking at Colt in the barn doorway. "We brought food," he said. "I see that." Emmett had a cooler on the back of his bike. Calvin had a grocery bag. Tucker had what appeared to be a full bag of charcoal. "We thought you could use a Saturday that was just a Saturday," Ray said. Colt looked at the 22 men in his driveway. At the cooler and the charcoal and the grocery bags. At Ray's face, which was doing the particular thing it did when Ray was saying something without saying it. He stepped out of the barn doorway. "Grill is in the back," he said. They set up the barbecue the way they set it up, everything with the division of labor that did not require discussion, each man finding the thing that needed doing and doing it. Tucker had the charcoal going in 10 minutes. Emmett was opening the cooler. Calvin had produced a speaker from somewhere, and there was music too loud exactly right. Hazel came out of the house at noon, her class done. She stood on the porch and looked at the yard full of men and bikes and smoke and noise and shook her head slowly with the expression she had when she was trying not to smile. Ray looked up and waved. She came down the porch steps. She moved through the yard with the careful ease she had developed over years of managing her energy, talking to each of them briefly, moving from conversation to conversation with the social fluency she had inherited from her mother. She had known these men since she was a child. They were, in the most accurate sense of the term, her family. Garrett Flynn arrived around 1 in the afternoon. He came in his own truck, civilian clothes, looking slightly uncertain about whether his presence was appropriate. He had met Colt once since the arrest was dismissed, a brief and businesslike conversation at the county office when Colt had come in to sign paperwork. He had not expected to be invited to this. He had not been exactly, Ray had called him. He stood at the edge of the yard holding a six-pack he had brought because bringing something seemed right, and Ray came over and shook his hand and said, "You did good work. Come eat." Garrett came in. Colt was at the grill. He looked over and saw Garrett and held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Garrett nodded back. That was enough. Gallagher arrived around 3 in the afternoon. He came in his personal truck out of uniform, and he sat in it for a moment before getting out. Hazel saw him from the porch and watched him get out and stand at the edge of the yard with the particular look of a man who was not sure of his welcome but had decided to show up anyway. Ray was nearest the gate. He walked over and extended his hand. Gallagher took it. That was all it took. He came in. He found a chair. He accepted a plate from Tucker without ceremony. He sat with the quiet ease of a man who was making an effort and knew it and was doing it anyway. Colt saw him from the grill. He looked at the sheriff sitting in his yard, at the food on his plate, at the way he was holding himself, not quite at ease, but working toward it. He picked up a beer. He walked over. Gallagher looked up. Colt held out the beer. Gallagher took it. They stood together for a moment without speaking, looking at the yard, at the bikes along the fence, at Hazel talking to Emmett, by the cooler, at the smoke from the grill rising into the October sky. "How is she doing?" Gallagher said quietly. "Better. Doctors are cautiously optimistic." Colt looked at his daughter. "She enrolled in a management course. Agricultural, online." "Good." "Yeah." They were quiet. "I talked to Sandra Howell," Gallagher said after a moment. Colt looked at his beer. 9 years, Gallagher said. Colt did not say anything. "She wanted me to tell you the fund helped 17 families last year." Gallagher looked at him. "She said to say thank you." Colt was quiet for a moment. "Tell her she is welcome." He looked out at the yard. "Tell her it needed doing." Gallagher looked at him for a moment. Then he looked out at the yard too. "Marcus coaches youth football," Gallagher said, "in Knoxville." "You told me." "He is good at it." Gallagher's voice had something different in it now, something that had come through whatever had been in front of it. "2 of his kids have the same stubbornness as their grandfather. He blames me." "Seems fair." Gallagher made the sound, again the one that was almost a laugh. He drank the beer. Around them, the afternoon went on. The music was too loud. The smoke from the grill moved across the yard in the October breeze. 22 men and a young woman and a sheriff and a deputy moved through the afternoon the way people move through time when they are choosing to be present in it, talking and not talking, eating and passing plates. The particular comfortable noise of people who had been through something difficult and had come out the other side and were now choosing to be somewhere without a wall at their back. Hazel stood on the porch for a while just watching. Her father was near the grill with his brothers, and he had his head thrown back, laughing at something completely unguarded, the full-body laugh that he almost never let happen in front of people outside of this specific company. She watched him. She watched the sheriff cross the yard to stand beside him and watched them exchange a few words and watched her father nod and hand him another beer. She thought about everything she had believed for years, about the noise the bikes made on Saturday mornings, about the way the town looked at the men in those vests, about the neighbors on the road with their phones up on the morning of the arrest. She thought about 2 in the morning in February, 3 years ago, a car driving fast through dark roads to the emergency room with Ray's hands calm on the wheel, and his voice steady, saying, "You are okay. We are almost there. You are okay." She thought about a kitchen table covered in sticky notes, about a pill cup arranged before dawn, about a man who had gone into floodwater twice in 2001 and never mentioned it to anyone who mattered to him for 22 years because he did not consider it relevant to who he was. She went down the porch steps and crossed the yard to her father. He turned when he heard her coming, the way he always turned, with the specific awareness that was involuntary, the radar that had been running on her signal since she was 17 years old, and he had understood that she needed him to stay. She stood next to him. He put his arm around her shoulder the way he had since she was small, and she leaned into it the way she always had, and for a moment they just stood there together in the middle of all of it, in the afternoon light. "This is a good day," she said. He looked out at the yard, at the bikes along the fence, at Ray talking to Gallagher, at Tucker trying to get the speaker to connect to a different phone with the focused frustration of a man who had been mechanically competent for 40 years and was routinely defeated by wireless technology. At Garrett Flynn eating a plate of food with the slightly dazed expression of someone who had not expected to end up here. "Yeah," he said. She looked up at him. "I put in the application for the full-year program, agricultural management. You will be sick of hearing about soil pH by spring." He looked down at her. "Good," he said. She smiled, real and full, her mother's smile in every line of it. He held on to that. 1 year on the farm ran better than it had in a decade. The South Field had the best hay yield in 5 years. The cattle herd was up by 4. The orchard had come in strong for the second year running, and Hazel had made enough pear preserves to last the winter and enough apple butter to give away to half the county, which she had done without ceremony, leaving jars on porches and in mailboxes. Some people knew where they came from. Some did not. She had her father's particular understanding that the giving and the knowing were separate things. Her health was stable. The cardiologist at her October appointment had used the phrase cautiously optimistic 3 times in 12 minutes, which was, as the doctor herself acknowledged, a record for that phrase in the context of this particular patient. Hazel had taken this with the precise dry humor she brought to all medical appointments and had asked the doctor to put that on the record. The doctor had laughed. She had put it on the record. Colt walked the fence line every morning. He got up before dawn and made coffee and measured the medications and left breakfast warming. He had not changed this routine since the morning 3 years ago, when Hazel had leaned in the kitchen doorway and told him he did not need to spend every minute. He had known then, and he knew now, that she was right in the way she was often right, and that he was going to keep doing it anyway in the way he kept doing most things. Some habits were not habits. They were decisions remade every morning at 4:53. Hazel finished her first semester with marks that her professor described in an email she showed her father with careful casualness as exceptional. She started the second semester in January. She decided she told him over dinner in February that she wanted to take the advanced soil science module in spring, which required a prerequisite she did not technically have, but that her professor thought she could handle given the quality of her work. She offered a waiver, Hazel said. "Take it," Colt said. "I thought you might say that. Is there a face for that one?" "There is," she said. "It is the face that means you already knew what I was going to say." He drank his coffee. Spring was excellent that year. Warm and wet in the right proportions. The kind of spring that the old farmers in the valley described as a good year waiting to happen. The hay came in strong. The kitchen garden produced more than Hazel had planned for, which meant preserving sessions at the kitchen table on 3 separate weekends, jars lined up on the counter, the house smelling of tomatoes and vinegar, and the particular sweetness of late summer. Colt understood in a way that had deepened over the past year that this was what the land had always been offering. Not just a place to stand, not just equity or heritage or any of the words that people use for why land mattered. The rhythm, the specific structure of days that came from being responsible to something larger than yourself that also needed you. He needed the farm. He had not always known that as clearly as he knew it now. The Veterans Fund held its annual dinner in September. Sandra Howell had organized it the same way she organized it every year, a function room at the county building, folding tables. Contributions from local restaurants, a modest program. The connection between Colt and the anonymous donor had been in the particular way of small communities no longer precisely anonymous, though nothing official had been said. Sandra called Colt in August and asked if he would attend. He was quiet for a moment on the phone. "I'm not going to make you speak," she said. or be recognized. I just think it would be good if you were there." He thought about it. "All right," he said. He sat in the back. He wore his vest because he did not own clothing that was more formal and saw no reason to acquire it for this occasion. He ate the food that was provided and listened to the program and watched the families who were receiving assistance from the fund, 17 of them that year, move through the room with the particular mix of gratitude and dignity that people carry when they have accepted help they needed. He recognized two of them, not personally, but the situation. The particular posture of people who had hit something hard and were getting back up. He stayed for the whole program. He shook Sandra's hand on the way out. She held it for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said, "for 9 years. He looked at her. "It needed doing." She smiled at him. "You keep saying that. It keeps being true." He went home. He let himself in the back door. The house was quiet. Hazel had gone to bed early, a cardiologist appointment in the morning. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the dark, not turning on the light. He thought about the families at the dinner, about Carol and her boys, about the 2 families the prosecutor was working restitution for, about the slow machinery of consequence grinding forward without drama in the direction the evidence pointed. He thought about the orchard, about October light. He turned on the lamp. He made a cup of coffee he did not need and did not drink. He sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and looked at the refrigerator door, at the sticky notes in their familiar positions, and let himself feel briefly and privately the thing he rarely allowed himself to feel fully. Not pride, something quieter than pride, something that did not have a name, but that lived in the chest like a held note. The farm was here. She was here. The morning would come the same morning it always was, and he would be up before it the way he always was, because some decisions did not require reconsideration. He turned off the lamp. He went to bed. Outside, the valley was dark, and the creek moved, and the land held the way it held every night, the way it would hold tomorrow, the way it held through everything that had been done to it and against it and in spite of it. Everything began again. That was the thing about this place. That was the thing about the particular decision a man made when he folded a letter and walked to the burn barrel. Not a decision against something, a decision for something. The morning, the pill cup, the sticky notes, the daughter at the kitchen table with her laptop and her tea and her soil science textbook. A life organized entirely around love. Ray came out on Saturdays. Sometimes others came with him. The diner table was always there on weekends, the reserved card in its place, Bobby Mercer waving them in from behind the counter with the ease of a man who had decided something and was comfortable with having decided it. Emmett had a habit of arriving on Thursday afternoons, which was when Colt usually did his equipment maintenance, and simply picking up a wrench and starting in on the next item on the list without being asked. They would work for 2 or 3 hours talking when there was something worth saying, not talking when there was not the comfortable rhythm of men who had worked alongside each other enough times that the silence between them was a form of conversation. Calvin brought his cousin out, once a man who was thinking about getting into beekeeping and had heard that Colt kept bees on the South Slope. Colt spent 45 minutes showing him the hives, talking through the basics, with the specific patience he applied to anything that required care and attention. The cousin drove away with his head full of information and a jar of honey from the previous fall's harvest. He had not been asked if he wanted the honey. It had simply been put in his hands. Tucker, who farmed the property 2 fence lines over and had watched the whole campaign against Colt, with the particular guilt of a neighbor who had noticed things late, came by one afternoon in November with something he had been carrying for weeks. He had seen the truck on the back road, not just on the night the equipment was dropped, but on 2 other nights in the weeks before, driving without lights along the access road. He had noted it and not known what to do with it, and eventually decided that doing nothing was no longer an option. He had written it down, dates, times, a description of the vehicle. He handed the sheet of paper to Colt. Colt read it. Then he looked at Tucker. "This would have helped," he said, "not accusatory, just factual." "I know," Tucker said. Colt folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "I will send it to the attorney." Tucker nodded. They stood in the yard for a moment. "I should have said something sooner," Tucker said. Colt looked at him for a moment. "You said something now." That was all. They shook hands. Tucker walked back down the driveway. The paper went to the attorney. It was added to the file. It was one more thread in a fabric that was already dense with threads, and it mattered. In the way that each additional thread matters, not transformatively but cumulatively. The way testimony always matters, the way the record of what happened always matters, because the record was the thing that outlasted individual memory and individual shame and individual forgetting. Gallagher stopped at the farm 3 times in the year that followed. Never official, never in uniform. Once to bring a book that Marcus had asked him to pass along, a soil management textbook his son had found at a used bookstore in Knoxville and thought Hazel might use for her course. Once just to check in, as he put it with the awkward directness of a man who was learning a new kind of visiting. Once because it was the anniversary of Linda's death and he had driven out to the valley in the early morning without quite knowing why, and had found Colt already at the fence line, and they had walked it together without speaking, and then Colt had made coffee and they had drunk it on the porch in the cold, and that had been all, and it had been enough. On a Saturday afternoon in late October, the second year after everything, Hazel came down the orchard slope with a bucket of the last apples. Her hair loose, her boots dark with dew from the grass. She found her father sitting on the low stone wall at the bottom of the slope where it met the yard, looking at the ridge to the east. She sat down next to him. The eastern ridge was going into shadow the way it went every afternoon at this time of year, the light pulling back from the valley floor and leaving everything in the particular blue-gray that preceded dark. The creek was audible from here, the soft, persistent sound of moving water that had been the background of this farm for 3 generations. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He looked at the ridge. "Your grandmother used to sit here," he said, "before she passed. Your mother told me, said she would sit here at the end of the day and look at the ridge." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to wonder what she was looking at. After a while, I stopped wondering." Hazel looked at the ridge. "It is just the ridge," she said. "Yes." "And the light." "Yes." She sat with that for a moment, the bucket of apples between them on the wall, the cold coming in from the north, the sound of the creek. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, thank you." He looked at her. "For not selling it," she said, "for all of it." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the ridge. "It is yours," he said. "It has always been yours." She looked at the ridge, too. The light was almost gone from the eastern face now, the shadow full across the slope. The sky above was the deep, late afternoon blue that came before the first stars. The creek moved. The land held. The light went and came back the way it always did, the way it would keep doing long after this afternoon and this season and every season that had come before it. Some things were worth the fight, not because they were perfect, not because the fight was clean, or the outcome was guaranteed, or the cost was something a person could calculate in advance and agree to pay, but because some things once lost could not be recovered, and some people, once they understood that, did not look away from it. The thing about small towns is that they forget slowly, not the important things. Those stayed the way things that had been decided publicly and officially stayed as a matter of record, unchangeable. But the ambient assumptions, the background judgment that accumulated around a man like sediment, around a stone, those cleared more slowly. Not with a single announcement or a council meeting statement. With time and repetition in the accumulation of small, specific observations. Mrs. Patterson had told the story of the pie at least 15 times by the following spring. Each time she told it, she added a detail. Not inventing or remembering the way the act of telling lets the memory open up. The hardware store owner had heard it. The diner owner had heard it. The woman who ran the post office had heard it and told the woman who came in after her, who told her daughter, who was in the same study group as a young man whose father had worked with Colt on a firebreak project 3 years earlier. These were the mechanisms of small-town knowledge. Slow and decentralized, and over time surprisingly complete. By summer, the working assumption about a man in Millhaven was no longer what it had been. Not dramatically, not with an official announcement that everyone had been wrong, just a slow recalibration, conversation by conversation, until the weight of the misunderstanding had been replaced by something more accurate, even if it was never fully named. Colt noticed it in the way a person notices things they are not paying direct attention to. The nod from the man at the feed store who had not previously nodded. The table at the diner where someone had apparently decided that sitting at the neighboring table was fine rather than not fine. The comment from a council member made in passing at the gas station in the most perfunctory and indirect way possible that amounted to an acknowledgement without any of the components of an apology. Colt received all of it without comment. He did not require it to be more than it was. He did not catalog it or hold it against what it could have been sooner. He had his fence line and his horses and his morning routine. These things were enough. A man who had gone into cold water twice in 2001 and never mentioned it to the people he loved most. A young woman who had built a legal document in 3 days from a couch where her heart was telling her to slow down. A deputy who had asked careful questions and put them in writing. A farmer who had kept a locked box in his truck because paper was harder to delete than files. A sheriff who had taken his hat off on a farmhouse porch and said the right thing finally after it mattered. All of them in their own way showing up. That was what the story kept coming back to if you looked at it honestly. Not the villain, though there was one, and not the legal case, though it mattered, and not even the land, though it was the container for everything else. The story kept coming back to showing up. The specific repeated choice to be present, to do the thing that needed doing, to go back into the current when the sensible thing was to stay on the bank. Colt had made that choice in a flooded road in 2001 for strangers he would never see again. He had made it again and again in the years that followed, in a kitchen before dawn, in a barn in the dark, in a hospital parking lot, at a fence line in the cold, in every single ordinary moment that added up over 20 years to a life that was entirely and without apology organized around another person. He had never thought of it as sacrifice. He had never thought of it as virtue. He had simply understood at some point early and clearly that this was what he was for, and he had gone ahead and been it. Ray Holden understood this about him, had understood it for 12 years, and had never said anything about it directly because direct speech about certain things had a way of diminishing them by making them visible and nameable when their power came precisely from being lived rather than described. Ray showed up instead. He showed up the way Colt showed up, without announcement, without requirement of acknowledgement, with the steady, reliable presence of someone who had decided that this person mattered and was going to keep acting on that decision. That was what 22 men in leather vests looked like from the inside. That was what the patch on the back could not show you, and what the interior lining almost could. The world saw what it chose to see. The vest, the patch, the trucks on Saturday mornings, and the loud music, and the men who took up too much space at the diner. It saw the legal case and the arrest and the equipment behind the shed. What it did not see was the pill cup before dawn, the sticky notes on the refrigerator, the anonymous donations year after year from a man who was behind on his own bills, the 2 a.m. drive to the emergency room, the fence repaired without being asked, the groceries carried and the water bill paid, and the 22 brothers who showed up every time without being called. The strongest patches are never the ones that show. They are the ones stitched in where no one can see them, in the places where a person decides quietly and completely who they are going to be. Not once, not in a crisis, but every morning before the sun comes up, in the ordinary sacred repetition of a life that has been organized around love. That was Colt Decker. That was in the end the whole story. The land held. The creek moved. The light came back. The strongest patches are the ones you never see. They are the ones that hold.